Mornings aren't my best time to teach. It never sounds like. Well, I've been up now. I didn't get up 5 minutes before I had to be over here, but praise the Lord. It always gets better as the day goes on. I'm a night teacher, I think, better than a morning one. Praise the Lord. So you have to carry the service sometimes in the morning, and I'll carry them at night. In ethics, we're going to be looking for a few more weeks at some historical material. We don't have a lot of preaching material here. And our purpose is just to give you a little of the background of the history of education. I have, well, not one, several books in my library, and I'm sure that I have maybe, 2 out of 2,000 that are available on some of the history of education. So we could say a lot more, but that would, I think, be purposeless. We can give you enough of an outline, which is all that we're really trying to do now, to let you know a little of the history, a little of the background of education, working our way up to public education here in this country. So we started back in earlier centuries, and we may not have even needed to say all of that. You could probably guess yourself that back in the Stone Age culture, they didn't have schools that they went to. Of course, there is such a thing as a Stone Age culture. We realize that, but it's because man devolved to that place. He started off much more intelligent than that. He ended up being a beast because he forsook God. And Paul tells us in Romans 1, whenever people forsake God, then their foolish minds are darkened, professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. Amen. Which is kind of a history of Gentile world development. But man has become more sophisticated in his foolishness as the years have gone along. He's still foolish. Sin darkens the mind and makes one a fool. But he's become more sophisticated. And we looked a little at education in classical societies. For all practical purposes, there was no such thing as any formal education. That doesn't mean the people were ignoramuses. They knew how to read and write, or they couldn't vote, or whatever they had to do. But they learned that at home. Education in biblical Israel, which was last time, and kind of before that, education in the church in the New Testament. Maybe that the chronology is a little reversed there, but there aren't any verses in the Bible, in other words, for either the Old Testament Jew or for the Christian under the New Covenant. There are no verses to support any form of education besides education at home. And the education at home had one supreme goal and purpose behind it, and that was to so equip the person that they could better know and serve God. It wasn't so they could get a better paying job or something. It was so they could better know and serve God. And in the process of learning to know how to better serve God, maybe you do learn enough that you can get some type of job that a person who couldn't read or write could not get. But be that as it may, there's not any formal compulsory public education. So let's jump past century 1, first century A.D., and just make some brief comments that, like, for the next 1,000 years, part of that period is even called the Dark Ages. It's based on, just for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into, but maybe a lot of it really traces itself back to some invading bands. They came in from the east. They did attack the city of Rome. The city of Rome fell in the 5th century A.D. Whenever the city of Rome fell, Rome was it had lasted for almost 1,000 years. It had been a very important city. It was very literate, very cultured. And whenever they're called invading barbarians. I don't know how much we want to make of the term barbarians, but let's say they were on a lower level than the citizens of Rome, that's for sure. Whenever they came in and destroyed the city, like around 478 A.D., then that just brought a decline to culture and to civilization as we understand it here in the West. All of the Goths, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Huns, the Vandals, you've heard these before in school, these names, and you've probably heard me mention them somewhere along the line. Whenever they came in, then all of European history goes into a period of decline called the Dark Ages. Now, historians of that period want to be sure that we realize that doesn't mean that there wasn't some cultural and literary advancement in isolated spots during that period of history. There were such periods of advancement. But on the whole, I think that the whole European community went into decline. And it's not until the 11 and 1200s, 12th and 13th centuries, that Europe really begins to bring itself out of this pit into which it has fallen. So in other words, there's very little that can be said about formal education between the end of the first century and 1,000 years later, the dark ages of the church. They really don't start until several centuries later, but still that whole period. And then it's during the 12th and 13th centuries that for the first time in history, now this is the first time and this is unique, you have the rise of the great European universities, beginning with the founding of the University of Paris, which I think was back in the 1100s, somewhere around that period. And I believe, if you just want to take a note of this, that on lit tapes 145 and 146, we discussed some of this. I know we discussed it back in biblical literature. We began first looking at some of the English attempts, and we saw some of the earlier ones, like the ones by Venerable Bede and Kedman and so forth back in the 9th century A.D. But those were metrical paraphrases. They were composed by English poets around campfires when they didn't have anything else to do, and it really wasn't until the time of people like Wycliffe and company that you really had your first start on formal Bible translation as far as the English language is concerned. And he happens to be living right during this period of time. So somewhere along there in that connection, I gave you just a little of the history of the fact that we have on the scene the rise of the great, the beginning of the rise of the great universities in Europe, such as the University of Paris. That, I think, was the first one, Paris, France. And you had others that followed after that, others in Italy and in Germany. And then, of course, later, somewhat later, you have the rise of the important universities up in the British Isles, like in Scotland, all the fame in Ireland, but like especially Scotland, your Aberdeen, St. Andrews, what are some of the others? Edinburgh, what are the others? There's one other, there's 4 big universities up in Scotland. Then, of course, you have your well-known ones down in England, like Oxford and Cambridge, but they come quite a bit later. Well, the rise of universities is presupposing that you already have the type of training and learning that would make you a candidate for the university. You must know something before you can go into the university and take some of these more advanced studies. Well, does that presuppose public schools widespread? No, it still doesn't. You still don't have public schools then. Those things simply aren't known in Europe at this time. They come quite a bit later, which is what we're going to get into here in just a moment. All that presupposes, and it's very remarkable, is that some people, not all, but some, were doing a very good job of training at home or training through private tutoring. Oftentimes, training through private tutoring was the way in which the children of important people received their education. But here you've got something more than just the Greek academies. You've got something more than that. You've got public universities. Some of them, maybe most of them, in their earliest days start from a religious persuasion or conviction. But so you might tend to think of them as private. But you've got many of them that are not private in that sense. They don't have a particular religious persuasion. They simply are on the rise. Now, from that period, you can see how sketchy this information is, but I'm just trying to give you an outline. From that period up until the Reformation, about 300 or 400 years later, you've just got a continuation of what I've been discussing thus far. But I want to concentrate in the first place this morning on the rise of education, the rise of public education during the period of the Reformation. And let me just make this statement, that is really when public education first comes on the scene. And it is in a very infant stage. But that is when public education really comes on the scene. The 16th century, the 1500s, the period of the Reformation. And I want to discuss a little of the background, how this came about, what were some of the historical incidents and dates and people involved, what were some of the causes for the rise of education. Now you know what the Reformation is about. The revolt of the Protestant church against the Roman Catholic Church. So you can tell right away there's going to be some type of religious connection to this all, a religious grounding. And there certainly is. So let's start with Martin Luther, since Martin Luther is the earliest of the important reformers, and I guess you could say he's the most important reformer as far as Reformation is concerned. You know, back in the early 1500s, October the 31st, 1517 to be exact, but back in the early 1500s, Martin Luther tacks his 95 Theses on the door of the chapel in Wittenberg, Germany. And that is his call for Reformation. Now this is a timid Luther who had finally lost his timidity as he lectured his students. He was a professor of theology, Roman Catholic professor of theology at the University in Wittenberg in Germany. And as he lectured his students on the book of Romans, now we're talking about Roman Catholic priests that were under, and students that were under the professorship and teaching of Martin Luther. But lecturing on the book of Romans, lecturing on it in Latin, of course, since that was the language of the Roman Catholic Church, means that you've got some people here, and you live in Germany, so you must be able to speak German, and you can read Latin, and they're being trained to read Greek, and they're being trained to read Hebrew as well. This goes back to some of the tapes we did in Biblical Lit as well. Whenever Constantinople fell and brought a lot of the manuscripts and scholars from the east to the west, and the invention of the printing press and this combination of things, you got a rise of desire to go back to the original, to go back to the sources. That was one of the famous calls of the Renaissance period, back to the sources, which means back to the original languages of Hebrew and Greek, and, well, classical languages, Greek and Latin as well. But in the year 1524, Martin Luther sent a letter off to the German princes and urged upon them. Now, Germany, you have to understand, I don't know how much you know about history, but, well, you probably know at least this much, that the map of Europe today has constantly changed. I mean, over the years, the centuries, it has constantly changed, and it won't stay the way it is now forever. Just in our generation, changes have been made right on the map of Europe, and it won't always be that way. Back in Martin Luther's day, there wasn't any such thing as Germany, like we think of it as a big country called Germany. It was a province, but it was divided up into all different types of divisions, and you've got different German princes who rule over the various divisions. And so Martin Luther sent off a letter in the year 1524 to some of these German princes, urging upon them state-controlled schools and compulsory attendance at them. So this whole business of popular education really comes from a religious perspective, and it comes from the giant of the Reformation, Martin Luther. State-controlled schools and compulsory attendance is first urged by Luther in 1524. Now we're going to see why. He's got some reasons why. His reasons, well, I wouldn't say his reasons aren't valid, but the way he goes about it certainly is not a valid way. 4 years later, in 1528, you just sketch what you think is important, because there's just tons of information that's not necessary to know. 1528, Luther's own plans. He had some ideas in his own mind what education should be like, and his own plans were followed through in Saxony. Now that's one of the divisions of, quote, Germany, unquote. Well, like Italy. Italy was just nothing but a partition, divided group of I don't know what until the late 1800s, whenever Bismarck comes to some control. And you've got a lot of redivision and realignment in Germany, and you've got the same thing done in Italy. And Italy doesn't even become a country as we know it today. Italy occupying the boot that we call Italy till the late 1800s. But Saxony, I'm sure you've heard of that, it's one of the divisions in Germany, and Luther's own plans are put into action and followed through. In Saxony in 1528, these are some of the earliest public, popular schools in history. In the year 1559, in Württemberg, schools are established by the German princes there, and for the first time, attendance is made compulsory. Now, that was not true in Saxony in 1528. In 1559, some of the German reformers' plans for public schooling are put into action in Württemberg, Wurttemberg, and attendance is made mandatory. Now, these schools in the provinces of Germany became the models for the schools which would later arise in Prussia. Prussia. Prussia is no longer a country. It's been absorbed. It was absorbed into the Austrian-Hungary Empire, and now there's no longer an Austria-Hungary Empire, but there are two countries called Austria and Hungary, no longer a country called Prussia. I need to stop getting off into that history. That's not important for us this morning. These became the models for schools later in Prussia. And if you know anything about public education in the United States, you know that public education in the United States was patterned after the Prussian model. So we won't discuss the Prussian model yet this morning. That will come a little bit later. But just to let you know that the Prussian model is founded on the model in Germany that was established by Luther. And the schools, the early schools here in the United States of America, were modeled after the so-called ideal schools that were seen in Prussia. So I'm just trying to make a connection. I'm getting ahead of myself to make a connection, and you'll hear us come back to this later in the future. All right, so there's some of Luther's ideas about the whole matter. And then let's come secondly to another reformer, John Calvin. John Calvin, he saw things a little differently than Luther, but one thing they were in agreement about was the need for popular public education. Luther's in Germany, Calvin's a Frenchman, but he does most of his work in Switzerland. It's really almost by accident that John Calvin ends up being so well known in history as to his connection to the city of Geneva, which is way down in the southwestern portion of Switzerland, where you find Lake Geneva. He passed through there one night. He was on his way somewhere else. He arrived at night so no one would find him. He was going to be gone the next morning, and Pharaoh caught him, and Pharaoh lectured him and said, "You got to stay. We need a teacher. We need a theologian of your caliber to stay here and help the infant Protestant church get off the ground here in Geneva, Switzerland." And Calvin said, No. Got other things to do. And Calvin was a real scholarly, bookish type man. And all he wanted to do is be left alone. Just give me a study and I'll write from there. And whatever you need, I'll do the writing. He didn't want to be around people. He didn't like people. He didn't like any of that. He just wanted to be alone. And Pharaoh couldn't talk him into it at all. Pharaoh was one of the early Geneva, Switzerland reformers as well. And a lot of them had been influenced by Luther. You see, they had come out of or had been somehow influenced by the German Lutheran Reformation and Revolution that was taking place. But anyway, to finish Calvin's story, how Pharaoh detained him that night in Geneva, and then he ends up, of course, Geneva is his home place for the rest of his life. And down through history, when you think of Calvin, you think of Geneva, and vice versa. But Pharaoh said, "All right." He said, "May God Almighty curse your bones if you leave this place and don't help us." Well, maybe Calvin still had enough Roman Catholic superstition to him to take that to heart, and that was the one thing. I mean, Pharaoh couldn't convince him otherwise, but he said, "May God Almighty curse your bones if you leave us." Well, Calvin said, "I think I'll stay." So he stayed. I mean, he was going to be gone the next morning, but he stayed. He never left. Well, he left once to go, or a couple of times to go elsewhere, but he always came back, and that was his home place. My point in all of that is in the year 1536, Calvin is Calvin is coming to Geneva, and Geneva is already establishing its first public schools, the year 1536. Notice this is right around the same time Luther is doing things over in Germany. Switzerland and Germany, border on one another. There I go into history again. I love history and geography. Just bring a globe or a map with you in these studies. Well, we'll be through with it this morning because we won't be back to European history. We'll be back over to United States history. Calvin is probably best known not as a reformer per se. Luther is the one who really causes things to get going, and he's the bull in the china shop, as it were. And he's the voice, and he's the power. He's the personal presence behind the Reformation. Calvin is the mind. Calvin is the intellect behind it all. Calvin is probably best known for his theology, Institutes of the Christian Religion, as is advertised on his book by Will Durant, one of the 10 books that shook the world. And I'm sure that's true. You could probably say one of the 5 books that shook the world was Calvin's Institutes. Now, they were only done back in 1536. Now, you know, how many books stay in print 15 years? 1536. And Calvin's theology is still in print. He's also known for something else, though. Calvin's not only very well known and remembered for his theology, Institutes of the Christian Religion, he's equally, perhaps, if not just slightly less, well known for his establishment of the Genevan Academy in the year 1559. Now, this is just a couple of years before Calvin dies. Calvin dies in the early 1560s. 1559 is when he sends out his final revision, I believe, of his theology. It had gone through many different revisions. It started off by a 26-year-old man, Calvin, in 1536 as just a little pamphlet of a few pages, and now it's 2 big, thick volumes of about 12 or 1,300 pages. Well, he finishes that in the end of the 1550s, and in 1559 he establishes the Academy, which was a place in Geneva to train up and coming young Protestant men. They came from all over Europe, not just Swiss people. They came from all over Europe, but especially from France and Switzerland, to be trained in all types of things. Now, to be sure, the heart of the curriculum would be Bible and theology and the original languages, but to be trained in all types of things, the sciences and so forth. And that academy lasted for a long time, and I guess the reason I'm saying Calvin is so well known, many leaders have thought this, that I can only do so much myself. But if I can found an educational institution where men can come and be taught, then look how I can increase by, multiples of 10 in a hurry my influence. Here's what I believe. I share it with them, and they share it with others, and more students come, and I share it with them, and they go out and share it with others, and it's just going to spread the tenets of the Reformation. And that's one of the very things that Calvin has in the back of his mind. It's a brilliant idea, but it's just going to lead to some other things as well, though. So there's what I want to say about a couple of the giants of the Reformation, Martin Luther and Calvin. Now, things that influence them and this decision in both of their lives, Luther and Calvin, to get on the ball establishing some type of public school system. Luther and Calvin aren't doing this in a vacuum without being influenced by other things around them. So I want to list about 4 different items that influence this move. In the first place, the leaders themselves, Calvin, Luther, and the men under them, the leaders themselves came from highly educated backgrounds. Now, if you're educated, then you tend to have a bias in favor of education. And if you're not educated, you tend to have a bias in favor of not being educated. Well, Luther and Calvin. Luther is a Roman Catholic monk and priest, a professor of theology. He would be equivalent to a professor of theology with a doctor's degree today. I mean, he was that well trained. He knew the languages. He knew German, Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Calvin was not a Roman Catholic priest. Although he had been a part of the Roman Catholic Church, Calvin was a lawyer. Calvin had been trained as a lawyer. And being trained in that type of background, it can't help but come out in his institutes. You see that he has a very clear way of analyzing things till he's got some unscriptural biases, and then his ability to analytically and precisely divide and discuss things, that evaporates then. Whenever you've got biases, you've got your mind made up. But Calvin is very convincing in the good parts of his theology, the Institutes of the Christian or to the Christian religion, because he's been trained to think clearly. He recognizes what the arguments are. He can assume the arguments in advance and prepare himself for those and refute those. I mean, he can anticipate the arguments. Well, a lawyer should be able to. You should be trained like that. But the point is, Calvin had himself been very well trained in the original languages. He knew Latin and he knew Greek and he learned Hebrew. He was very familiar with the early church fathers. In some recent message, I was telling you about Calvin's immense knowledge that he had of the early fathers and some of the scholastic theologians, to the point that he could quote them verbatim. I was saying how in places in Switzerland, the different cantons there, they would open up a public meeting for the defense of the Roman Catholic and the Protestant position. And they would have Roman Catholic priests in to defend and articulate their position, and they would have Protestant ones in, and then the people would vote as to which they wanted to follow. Switzerland has always been a very neutral, free type environment there, and they let the people follow. And I think I said that whenever Calvin would be asked in, he would always demolish the Roman Catholics because they would be fumbling, looking in their notes for something, and Calvin didn't use notes. He knew it all from memory. And he could quote the fathers, and if they ever misquoted, then he could correct them on that. And then all you have to do is call for the town library and bring that volume over, and we'll see who's right and who's wrong. So when Calvin always wins out, then the people kind of vote for Protestantism. You know, this man, if he knows that much, he must be right. That's not necessarily true, by the way. I mean, that'd be a poor way of judging it. Just because Calvin knows his material better than the Roman Catholics know theirs, that makes Calvin right? Well, that hardly makes any sense. But you know how the public can get caught up in the heat of an argument and discussion and debate, and they were in favor of the one who knew the most. So the leaders themselves come from highly educated backgrounds. They would have a bias in favor of that, in favor of education. These aren't a group of ignoramuses who are leading the Reformation. They are skilled, highly articulate people. So naturally they're going to be in favor of education. All right, a second thing that I think influenced them. I'm just giving these to you, whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying these are the facts here. The spirit of the times was the Renaissance. I mean, that speaks of a rebirth of learning. That was going on everywhere in Europe, not just among Protestant people, or not just among religious people. That was going on everywhere. The spirit of the times was the spirit of the Renaissance. So my point here is it's kind of hard to resist the current around you. It's hard to go against the current. We find the same thing today. Education has made a god in this country. It's kind of hard to go against that. Not vote in favor of no education, but just vote in favor of not so much education, or the way you're doing it, or what you're having to say. You don't find very many people willing to stand up and take a stand in that area, because you'd have to go against the current of the times, the spirit of the times, spirit of the Renaissance. Thirdly, the invention of movable type made the mass production of books available. And how can you have a school without books? Now that had just been invented about 100 years earlier, from the time of the founding of the Genevan Academy. And you can hardly have a very decent school, or you can't have the widespread existence of schools and the school system without books. Everything's in manuscript form. It's all done by hand. That was one of the very things that would keep public schools from arising over all these centuries we've been talking about. Everything is done by hand. You copy the manuscripts. They were done by professional people, scribes, copyists. And so how could you have a school for kindergarten or first grade age students when no one's going to be wasting their time writing material for them? What are you going to copy? The Latin or the Greek classics? They wouldn't understand them. They're children. You've got to write Mary Had a Little Lamb, and no one's going to be doing that. Not on valuable paper, on the material that they have. That is reserved for important material. You're not going to be copying things for kindergarten age people. So that's one of the very things that keeps education from ever coming about in a widespread fashion. The invention of movable type, the discovery of new ways to make paper, new ways to make ink, to make it all cheaper, makes available the mass production of books. Books are available on a scale that the world had never known of, never dreamed of before. They're available now. Well, all you got to do is find someone who has the money and who can pay a typesetter to get the plates cut out and set up and print it, and then that's all you have to do. Make your copies, and it could be kindergarten level. So this is happening around the same period of time. And then fourthly and finally, and I would say probably the most important idea behind this thought, was the thought that the Protestant Reformation, so let's get right into its religious background, the founding of public schools. The Protestant Reformation had newly arisen in a hostile, Catholic-dominated environment. They were outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1. The Protestant Reformation had newly arisen in a hostile, Catholic-dominated environment. Now, in order to maintain among these fledgling Christian Protestant churches Christian coherence and doctrinal purity, the leaders felt they had to reach their own people at the earliest possible age. Now, these are just my own notes. Maybe they're these schools, and gave their lives for the right and the privilege of translating the Bible into the native tongue of the people, because they knew if we don't do something to ensure the fact that this movement is going to outlive us. I mean, Luther's only going to live so long, he's going to die. Calvin, Zwingli, Farel, they're going to only live so long, they're going to die. If we don't do something to ensure the fact this movement's going to outlive us, then the Roman Catholic tide, which is out now, will just roll right back in, and it'll squash all of this that we've tried to do. So they knew they had to reach their own people at the earliest possible age and get them so indoctrinated into it all that they would never leave it whenever they grew older. So the thought that the Protestant Reformation had newly arisen in a hostile, Roman Catholic, influenced and dominated environment is, I think, the biggest idea in the mind of Luther and Calvin. In order to maintain these infant churches, this new theology which has arisen, I mean, you don't have any seminaries around that will support it, no books around it, everything's Roman Catholic. So in order to maintain Christian coherence and doctrinal purity, the leaders felt they had to reach their children at the youngest age possible. And in order to better equip them to battle the Catholics for control of Europe and its nations, they felt they needed to be as educated as the Roman Catholic leaders. In order to better equip their followers to do battle with the Catholics for control of Europe, they needed to be as educated as the Roman Catholic leaders. You see, well, you need to get that down. Let me give you a moment to write that down, and I can go further. The Roman Catholics are only concerned about training their ministers. Now, you think about this. You say, well, they train their children. The whole church service and everything is done in Latin. Their children don't know that. The common man and woman, they don't know that. The only ones who know that are the priests. The Roman Catholics consciously and with a purpose keep their people as ignorant as possible about anything religious or spiritual or historical or doctrinal. They keep them as ignorant as possible. The popes, you can read what the popes have to say time after time after time. The people are sheep. Sheep are dumb. The people are dumb sheep. We give them knowledge, then it's going to produce a heresy that's happened with people like Luther and Calvin, so keep them dumb. I would assure you that the Roman Catholics wish they had never educated Martin Luther in their Roman Catholic seminaries. I can assure you of that. He took all of that knowledge and blistered them with it. Calvin took all that. He had been trained in Roman Catholic schools. He took all of that knowledge and blistered them with that. They were the ones who taught him the church fathers. You wouldn't need to know that just for being a lawyer. Well, you got to understand about a lawyer. Calvin's background, and the same is true to some degree of his father, he was a lawyer in the church, where you would defend one parish or one priest versus another one. So don't think of a lawyer as something secular. A lawyer was something religious. Calvin was religious, so he had to have the religious training, but he was a lawyer. And Calvin got fed up with all the petty things. One Roman Catholic priest would want to sue another one, and he would defend, and the reason he'd want to sue him is because he's teaching heresy or something not right. And so Calvin's got to know the Father so that whenever you go to court, then you know your evidence. You can say, now this is what Chrysostom says, and the Catholics were always busy not quoting the Bible, but church writers that came after the Bible. So Calvin had to know a lot about that. I'm just saying that the Roman Catholics seriously regretted the fact they had taught people like Luther and Calvin, because they took that knowledge, turned against them, and used it against them. Used it for the benefit of this new fledgling movement called the Protestant Reformation. So the Catholics do not want to teach their young people anything. The Protestants, however, are just the reverse. Remember that another thing that comes with Martin Luther's theology is this so-called doctrine of the priesthood. What? What's the rest of it? Of all believers. The priesthood of all believers. In other words, the emphasis was upon the fact that God, His will, His word set this forth, wanted to deal with His people individually, not through some hierarchy, not through some minister, not through some priest, not even through some reformer, Luther or Calvin. God wanted to deal with His people individually. The doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. Well, how can God deal with you if you can't read or write or don't know anything about the Bible? Moreover, how can you, as a child, grow up to an adult and be in the position, whether you're in some religious calling, quote unquote, or not, to do battle with the Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic leaders, unless you are as educated as them? So, if we could draw a diagram up here, and we'd have the Roman Catholics over here on one side, we'd have their leaders up here as being intelligent men, trained, schooled, and the masses of their followers down here. Over here with the Protestant Reformation, we would have all the people trained. The young people, the old people, the men, the women, boys, girls, all of them trained. Some of them would later grow up and go to really higher education, like to the Genevan Academy, and become a Christian minister. But as you well know, the vast majority wouldn't. You can't have all ministers and no people to teach. The vast majority would, be a butcher or a baker or something. But they still had to know things. Reformers felt you have to know things because we want this whole movement to be an educated, a biblically based one, but an educated movement, so we can answer the Roman Catholics on their own ground, on their own territory. So I think that's the biggest thing that's going through the minds of people like Luther and Calvin. Only stands to reason. We have got to perpetuate ourselves, not just by our writings, institutes that we leave behind, but by our schooling, the Academy in Geneva, 1559. So let's sum up now our study of education during the Reformation period. And over the next, several decades, and you've got more and more. You go from just academies to, that's a higher school, a higher education. You go, there's much more than just that. You go from that down to, like secondary education and primary education. And it was a public schooling type thing, compulsory attendance. You learned, the heart of your curriculum was certainly theology and the Bible, but along with that has to be some history, has to be some mathematics and everything else. Just to do history, you have to know math to be able to subtract dates and end up with the right thing, or add dates and get an age for a man whenever he died. You got to know how to add, or you can't do that. So we see that the thrust of public education, the Reformation, started off very religiously inclined. Very religiously inclined. That was the heart of their curriculum. And the Reformers simply didn't have the foresight to see what would eventually happen when, like Luther, they asked the state to institute and force on citizens, popular education. Luther and Calvin are a little different in this regard, but remember what Luther did. He wrote German princes. Now, these are just secular men, political leaders, governmental controllers, urging upon them public education. Well, I don't think the Reformers had the foresight to see what would happen like what we have in the United States today. It's supposed to be a religiously founded country of ours, you see. But whenever you start moving 5 years, 10, 50, 100, a couple of hundred away from the men or the spirit or the causes that originally brought this thing about, whether it was the founding of this country or the beginning of the Reformation, and you as the religious leaders have invited, have asked, have urged upon the secular leaders in government to force education on the people, including your own people, I don't think they had the foresight to see what that would lead to. State-controlled education like we have today, where God, anything religious, is put out of the classroom. And in the beginning, public education, our education in this country came from Prussia, which came from Germany, which came because of the Reformation. If you knew nothing else, you ought to know that. And you can tell people a thing or two, you know, this business of, well, we don't want to teach religion, blah, blah. That's what education, as it was founded, was all about. The heart of the curriculum was God and theology. I'm not saying that it even should be that way, but I'm just saying if you're going to have it one way or the other, it should be that, and not what you have today. Where today it's supposed to be neutral, all we present are raw facts. We just present the facts in school. It's neutral education. Neutral education. No values are in it at all. Well, that's, of course, a myth, as we looked at Friday night. There are values there. Even if you say there aren't any values, that is your value then. A valueless education. And what's that? But secularism and nihilism. You're expressing philosophies, ideologies right away, just to say that. But these people are dumb. They don't see that. Well, at the time I have left this morning, I don't want to spend any more time there. I trust you don't have any questions, because we really don't need to go into any more detail. But let's go into the next place, the educational scene of early colonial America. We can skip over whatever's going on down in, Australia, because that's not affecting us. They didn't have any education down there anyway. They just sent criminals down there from England. They knew how to pick locks, I guess, but the Aborigines didn't use locks, so it didn't do any good. That's why they sent them down there. They couldn't get in any trouble down under, as they say. So let's skip over a little while, but not too far, because let's remember, United States starts just a few years after the Reformation. Well, not as a nation, but the Puritans come over rather early. So we'll call this colonial beginnings. Colonial beginnings. The Puritans left England for basically two reasons. Any of you know your history well enough? Why'd they leave England? All right, well, you may mean one of the two things. Could you be more precise? You could probably mean one or both of them.
Freedom of religion.
Okay, they want to escape for a religious point of view, or for a political point of view. First of all, they're wanting, if they're wanting freedom of religion, they're wanting freedom from the control of someone. So they're wanting to escape the tyranny of the King of England. Obviously, they want to escape the tyranny of the King of England. That's kind of like a political reason, although they're wanting it for religious reasons. But what's the other reason the Puritans leave? What's their name mean? They wanted to be pure. You see, there was a movement going on in the late 1500s, which is just after Luther and Calvin's death, in the early 1600s, in the Anglican Church, which, remember, has become the church in England at this day. But there was a movement going on to try to rectify some things in the Anglican Church. Some of the people thought that we could stay in the church, bloom where we're planted, and deal with it that way. Others felt, no, we want the church to be pure. We don't want to compromise between a Protestant faith and a Roman Catholic faith, which equals Anglicanism. That is a compromise. You're partly Protestant. You hold a justification by faith and not by works, but then you've got all the liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church. That is a compromise. They felt that there's nothing we can do for the church. They wanted a pure church. They wanted the church to be purified. And so they became known as the separatists. Since we can't purify the church, we will separate. So there were a couple of reasons they left England: to escape the tyranny of the king, unfair taxes and unfair political control they felt, and to escape the impurity of the Anglican Church. Now, what was the religious background of the Puritan people? I mean, were they Were they Wesleyans? Were they Lutherans? They were Calvinists to the core, through and through. They are in religious and church history one of the strongest groups of Calvinists that the world has ever seen, the Puritans. What they wanted to do was to create the perfect, pure, ideal Puritan society. Maybe we could leave the word pure out, since that would just be redundant. They wanted to create the perfect, ideal Puritan society. Escape the tyranny of the King of England, escape the impurity of the Anglican Church. There weren't any other places to go in Europe. Well, I guess you could have gone to the lowlands, because they have all the lowlands, which is not, as the word would seem, down low but up high, Belgium, the Netherlands, that area of Europe, because they've always been rather, whatever, or Switzerland, but they didn't want to do either of those things. There have been too many fights there, so we will go to virgin soil and territory. The, quote, New World, unquote, was known about, had been discovered rather recently, I guess we could say, not that much earlier. There was a new place here, offered new opportunities. There weren't any people there, except the people that own the land, called the American Indians, but they didn't count. They're savages, so there's no people there, there's no religion there. There was a religion, it was a false religion of the Indians, but there's nothing there. We'll go and establish the perfect, ideal Puritan community there, society. So this is what they desired to do. Now, I have to backtrack a little bit for a moment. Luther had placed the church in Germany under civil authority. Whenever you study Lutheran theology, you know that Lutheran has a doctrine that's called the doctrine of two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is stationed, focused in the church on the earth. And the kingdom of man is in civil, God ordained. That's why he could submit the church to them, he felt. But civil political government. So he had placed the church under civil authority. This is one place where Calvin differed with Luther. Calvin maintained, and you can read this in his Institutes, because he has a big discussion on civil authority. Calvin maintained that there should be an equality or partnership. And in this new experiment called Colonial America, this ideal, this Calvinistic Puritan ideal, transferred into an equation of church with government. Now get what you can down and then see if you can follow me here. They were on their way to this back in Switzerland, but it never quite worked out like it did in colonial America. Calvin maintained there should be an equality. You cannot submit the church to civil authority. And Calvin felt very strongly that we must obey God rather than man. But what that can eventually lead to, but the same Bible in Romans 13 says, obey the powers that are. Because there is no power but of God. Powers that be are ordained of God. Whoso resisteth the powers resisteth the ordinance of God. Romans 13:1. So they kind of got, I think, a little bit lopsided here. And maybe that was because a lot of the governments in Europe were controlled by the Roman Catholics. So to submit yourself to civil authority was to submit Protestantism to Roman Catholicism. So they were between the proverbial rock and a hard place. But this new experiment in colonial America shifted the focus a little bit and transferred Calvin's ideal into an equation of church with government. Not that there should be an equality between the two, although they should be separate and distinct. The civil authority controlled by the pagans, and the authority in the kingdom of God controlled by the church and her ministers. That equality has become an equation. There's a difference between the words equality and equation. Equality just means two things are equal to one another. Equation, they become the same thing. The church in colonial America was forming the first society. They didn't have to come into an existing political situation. They were the new political situation. And yet they were thoroughly religious. So since they were creating the first society, first town, the first community in a law-less, government-less, political-less land, they felt they had the right to make that government anything they wanted to make it. So they restricted voting privileges to church members. You couldn't vote, for instance, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony unless you were a church member. Well, what does that ensure? That ensures that the government won't be controlled by the church. The government will be the church and vice versa. They restricted voting privileges to church members. So members of the churches would vote for other members of the churches to control the community. You really can't even speak of a separation, at least in the early Massachusetts colony, which was the strictest, least tolerant of them all, by the way, and the most educated, as we will see, for, I guess, maybe the same reasons. One equals the other. In this colony, because you couldn't speak of two separate things, government and church, because the government leaders were faithful, some of the most important members of the church. So if you restrict voting privileges to church members, you ensure Calvinistic Christians in government. You ensure Christian government. It's kind of what people are wanting to do, the fundamentalists or right-wingers in America today. They would like to have their breed of religious men in office, is what they would like. We're going right back to colonial America. It'll never work. It never has, it never shall. The whole sham what was produced in Massachusetts Bay Colony. But then the people that chose to go another way were just as wrong. You just got to leave things alone. But then you've got to still have your own opinion in your church and let it be known. So the church became greater than any non-Christian civil authority, because in early Massachusetts there was no such thing as a non-Christian civil authority. The civil authority was the church. Now, not all people agreed with this narrow view and practice of things. You can see what they're trying to create, a kingdom of God right here on the earth, a perfect, ideal, Puritan society and community. You don't have to put up with the laws of the king because you make your own laws. You make your own religious laws. You make your own political laws. You are the law. Not all people agreed with that. Roger Williams is one well known with. You've heard of Roger Williams. You have to go back to some of your American history. Williams was hounded. Roger Williams, now that's just a name like, Benedict Arnold or something. That's supposed to stay with you. But he wanted more toleration than what Master... Now, he came from a strict Puritan Calvinist background himself, Roger Williams. But for whatever reasons, he ended up being a little more liberalized in his mind. But he wanted more toleration of opposing views, and he wanted the separation of the two, government from the church. I mean, think what the Massachusetts Bay Colony is doing. They left a place because of the prejudices and the lack of toleration in England. They're creating the exact same environment here. They left because people wouldn't tolerate the fact they had different views. So they created a society where they didn't tolerate different views. They should have known it'll never work. What we did to the King of England, someone else, namely Roger Williams, the witches of Salem, Anne Hutchinson, what we did to the King of England, someone's going to do to us. They're going to say, you bigots, you intolerant, narrow-minded people, maybe your view's all right. Don't try to impose them on other people, though. Now, that's kind of the beginnings of the spirit of pluralism there. But I don't know that either one is worse than the other, though. What do you want? To make the kingdom of God equal to civil authority? The Bible never teaches that. The church wasn't the government in the first century. The government always murdered the Christians and persecuted the church. So the church wasn't the government, but at the same time, the church also didn't just sit there and say, we believe in freedom of opinion. No, they didn't say that either. You see, they didn't follow either one of these things that were practiced in colonial America. They had their beliefs, and they announced to the world that the world was wrong, dead wrong, and they announced to all other religions that you're dead wrong, and all splinter groups and heresies, you're wrong, we're the only ones right. But they didn't try to control the society in such a way that if you could not get people to agree with you religiously, then you'd simply banish them put them in exile from your colony, or execute them, which is exactly what Massachusetts Bay Colony did. Let's start with the first one, Roger Williams. He wasn't executed, but he was banished in 1636. 6 years earlier is when Massachusetts Bay Colony is established, 1630. In 1636, Roger Williams was banished because of his views. He wanted toleration. He felt, listen, guys, we left a situation in England that we're recreating right here in our midst. He left it, and of course, you know what, he established the colony called Rhode Island. Something else happened in this year, 1536. The Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, we all know that the Pilgrims and Puritans landed here in Massachusetts. That's the most important of all 50 states, I guess we could say. That's the beginning of it all right there. Well, I know that there was they landed earlier down lower, and Augustine was founded in Florida and all this. But this is really the early colony. This is the important one. This is the major one, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They had received their own charter also. They appropriated 400 pounds, English money, toward the establishment in the future of a college or university, the year 1636. Now, just to show you what they thought about education, 400 pounds. Let me put that in perspective. You say, is that a lot of money or little money? What does that say about, if it's a lot of money, it says a lot about their educational ideals and goals. So let me put that 400 pounds in perspective. There were only 5,000 people at this time in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There were only 5,000 people. That 400 pounds represents more than all the taxes levied in 1 year on all the people. That's more than an entire year's income from taxes in the whole colony that they devote to one thing. They earmark it for the establishment of a future college. Now, we said before that Calvin had stressed education. The Puritans are Calvinists. Calvin had especially stressed education for its ministers. The Puritans, I don't know what your idea of them is. We kind of equate Puritans and Pilgrims. We think of, long muskets and those funny wooden shoes and hats and Indians and beads and trinkets and blankets and corn and Thanksgiving and turkeys and all this type of stuff. And I don't know what our real thoughts are about the Puritans, what type of people they were, but a huge number of the men who came over on the various ships from England, a huge number of the Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony were graduates of Oxford and Cambridge. These aren't European savages meeting Indian savages. These are very educated men. They needed a little help from the Indians to know how to live the practical life and make it through a winter or two. They didn't need any help on their A's and B's and C's, though. So I'm just saying again here, what's my point? They have kind of a bias for education. They are graduates of two of the best-known colleges in England, Oxford and Cambridge, often called Oxbridge. I guess you call them King Ford, but I've never heard of that, though. Oxbridge, that way you get both of them. They're graduates of Oxbridge. 2 years later, in 1638, a man by the name of John Harvard dies. Mr. Harvard, who himself was educated in England, at Oxbridge, left to this new institution, just founded by Massachusetts Bay Colony, the sum of 778 pounds. He was very rich. That's the equivalent of 2 years' worth of taxes on the entire colony. John Harvard died and left this new institution 778 pounds, and he left them, this is just unheard of in colonial, well, in many places, but certainly in colonial America this day. He left them his own private library, which was 300 books. Now, I know I've got thousands, so that doesn't sound like a lot to you. These books had to come over on those ships in crates. You didn't print them here in the United States, that's for sure. You didn't go into some teepee and say, hey, Chief Mino, you got a printing press here. You can print some books up here. They brought all those books over with them. 300 volumes privately owned in America, you know, where you're killing Indians and shooting beavers for their hides. And you got books, 300 books. That's just an unheard of thing. John Harvard gave his 300 books. That's the beginning. It's the foundation of the library down at Harvard University. Of course, we're talking about the founding of Harvard. A couple of years later, in 1642, I'm just outlining this for you. You can break it up on your paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, and have it outlined. The first law concerning education of American children was passed by the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The first law concerning the education of American children was passed by the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1642. Well, it looks like I'll have to say this. And what that law was, I will start reading to you next time. Praise the Lord, because we're out of time.